The wind howled through the empty main street of Cedar Ridge, carrying with it the bite of an early winter that had settled over the frontier town like a shroud. Reverend Samuel Hawthorne pulled his black coat tighter around his shoulders as he walked the final steps to the small wooden church that would be his new home. The boards creaked under his boots, a lonely sound that echoed in the darkness. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the rough wood. 28 years old, and already he felt the weight of a lifetime on his shoulders. The lamplight from within cast long shadows through the gaps in the planks, reminding him of prison bars, though those days were behind him now, or so he told himself. The church was modest, even by frontier standards. Built by the townspeople themselves 5 years prior, it stood as a testament to their faith, if not their wealth. Inside, 12 rough-hewn pews faced a simple pulpit. No stained glass adorned the windows, just clear panes that rattled in their frames when the wind picked up. A cross, fashioned from local pine, hung on the wall behind where he would preach come Sunday. Samuel set down his traveling bag and lit another lamp, chasing the shadows to the corners of the room. The previous minister had left 3 months ago, fled, more like it. According to the telegraph he'd received from the church board, something about the harshness of frontier life not suiting his constitution. Samuel understood. This land had a way of stripping a man down to his essence, revealing what lay beneath the veneer of civilization. He walked to the small room attached to the back of the church, his living quarters. A narrow bed with a straw mattress, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, a small stove for heat and cooking, and a desk where he would write his sermons. Spartan, but more than he'd had in those dark years before finding his calling. Samuel unpacked slowly, placing his Bible on the desk, hanging his spare shirt on a peg. His hands lingered on a small daguerreotype wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing the image of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Martha, dead these 5 years now, taken by the fever that swept through St. Louis. They'd been engaged, planning a life together. Then she was gone, and he'd fallen into a bottle, then into worse company, then into that cell where he'd finally found God, or God had found him. The memory threatened to pull him under, so he rewrapped the picture and placed it in the desk drawer. That was the past. He had come to Cedar Ridge to build a future, to shepherd souls in this harsh land. But as he sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the wind and the distant howl of coyotes, the loneliness settled over him like a physical weight. He'd been alone for so long, even surrounded by people in seminary, even preaching to congregations during his training. He'd felt set apart. The other ministers had wives, families. They went home to warm hearths and loving embraces. He went home to an empty room and cold sheets. Samuel stood and walked back into the church proper. His footsteps echoed in the empty space. Tomorrow, he would meet the townspeople. Sunday, he would deliver his first sermon. But tonight, he was just a man alone in a wooden box, surrounded by miles of prairie and mountains, with only the wind for company. He knelt before the simple altar, clasping his hands together. "Lord," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind, "you've brought me here for a purpose. Help me to serve these people well. Help me to be the shepherd they need." He paused, struggling with the next words. "And Lord, if it be your will, I've been alone so long. A man isn't meant to walk this path by himself. Send me a helpmate, someone to share this burden, this calling." The prayer felt selfish even as he spoke it. Hadn't Paul written that it was better to remain unmarried, to focus solely on the Lord's work? But Paul hadn't lived on the frontier, hadn't faced the crushing isolation of ministering to scattered souls across an unforgiving landscape. Samuel rose, his knees protesting from the hard floor. Through the window, he could see the lights of the town, the saloon glowing brightest of all, music and laughter drifting on the wind, the general store, the blacksmith shop, the boarding house, all dark now. And somewhere out there, the people he'd been called to serve. Farmers and ranchers, shopkeepers and laborers, the righteous and the fallen alike. He thought of the letter from the church board, warning him about the rough element in town. Cedar Ridge had grown quickly when gold was discovered in the nearby hills, though the mines had mostly played out now. What remained was a town trying to decide what it wanted to be: respectable settlement or just another dying boom town. The sound of a bottle breaking somewhere in the distance reminded him that sin was never far away out here. The saloon, the gambling house, the rooms above where women sold what they shouldn't have to sell. He'd minister to them all, if they'd let him. Christ had eaten with tax collectors and sinners, after all. But knowing his duty and facing the reality of it were two different things. Could he really make a difference here? Could one man, carrying his own burden of past sins, truly bring light to this darkness? Samuel extinguished all but one lamp and made his way back to his quarters. As he prepared for bed, he caught sight of himself in the small mirror above the washstand. Dark hair in need of cutting, eyes that had seen too much for his years, a face that might have been handsome if it didn't carry such obvious marks of past suffering. Who was he to think he could save anyone? He could barely save himself, but that was the point, wasn't it? Grace wasn't earned. It was given freely to the undeserving. He'd experienced that grace in a jail cell, felt it wash over him like cool water in the desert. Now it was his turn to extend that same grace to others. As he lay in the narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin, Samuel listened to the sounds of the night. The wind had picked up, whistling through gaps in the walls. Somewhere, a dog barked. The saloon was still going strong. He could hear the tinny sound of a piano, the occasional shout or laugh. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. He'd need to establish himself, earn the trust of the congregation, show them he wasn't going to flee like his predecessor. He'd need to be strong, authoritative, a pillar of righteousness in a town that sorely needed one. But tonight, in the darkness of his small room, Samuel Hawthorne was just a lonely man, praying for companionship, for someone to share this journey with him. The frontier was no place for the weak, they said, but it was also no place to be alone. As sleep finally took him, his last thought was a prayer, not for strength or wisdom or success in his ministry, but simply for an end to the echoing emptiness that had become his constant companion. God had brought him this far. Perhaps he had one more miracle in store. The lamp flickered and died, leaving only darkness and the sound of the wind, carrying with it the promise and peril of all tomorrows yet to come. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood at the far end of Main Street like a beacon of sin, its yellow light spilling onto the muddy thoroughfare. Inside, Margaret Maggie O'Brien wiped down tables with mechanical precision, her movements practiced from 3 years of the same routine. The clock above the bar showed past midnight, but the crowd was just beginning to thin. "Maggie, table 4 needs another round." Jake, the bartender, called out. She nodded, not trusting her voice. These days, she spoke only when necessary. She'd been beautiful once, the kind of beauty that turned heads and made men foolish, even now. At 26, traces of it remained in her green eyes and auburn hair. Though both had dulled with hardship, her dress, once fine blue silk, had been mended so many times it resembled a patchwork quilt. But it was clean. And she kept herself clean too, which was more than could be said for some of the other women who worked the saloon. As she delivered drinks to the poker table, one of the men, a rancher named Thompson, grabbed her wrist. "Why don't you sit a spell, Maggie? Bring me some luck." She extracted herself with practiced ease. "Can't tonight, Mr. Thompson. Too much work to do." He laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Too good for us now, are you? Weren't too good for William Ashford, were you?" The name hit her like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. William Ashford, even after 8 months. Hearing his name made her stomach clench. The wealthy mine owner who'd promised her everything: marriage, respectability, a house in San Francisco. She'd believed him, fool that she was. Given up her position as a seamstress, moved into the rooms he'd rented for her, let herself dream of a different life. Then his wife had arrived from back east, the wife he'd somehow forgotten to mention. The scandal had been the talk of Cedar Ridge for months. Ashford had left town with his wife, leaving Maggie with nothing but debts and a reputation in ruins. No decent establishment would hire her after that. The silver dollar had been her only option, that or starvation. "Leave her be, Thompson," Jake warned from behind the bar. He was one of the few who showed her any kindness, though she knew better than to mistake it for anything more than basic human decency. Maggie finished her rounds and stepped outside for a moment of air. The night was cold, winter settling in earnest now. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, though it did little good. Down the street, she could see the church, its simple steeple pointing toward stars obscured by clouds. A new preacher had arrived. She'd heard another man come to save their souls, no doubt, as if salvation was something that could be handed out like communion wafers. She'd been devout once. Her Irish Catholic mother had raised her on prayers and rosaries, on stories of saints and miracles. But that faith had died somewhere between her mother's death and William's betrayal. God, if he existed, had no interest in the likes of Maggie O'Brien. A drunk stumbled out of the saloon, nearly knocking her over. She sidestepped him with the fluid grace of long practice. Time to go back inside, to smile and serve drinks and pretend she didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the looks. The good women of Cedar Ridge crossed the street to avoid her now. She'd become what they warned their daughters about, a cautionary tale in petticoats and faded silk. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of faces and voices, of spilled beer and cigarette smoke. By the time Jake called last round, her feet ached and her head pounded. She helped him close up, counting her meager tips by lamplight, enough for another week's rent at the boarding house, if she was careful. Mrs. Henderson charged her double what the other boarders paid, the price of scandal, she supposed. The walk home was the worst part of her day. The streets were empty now, save for a few late-night stragglers, but she felt eyes on her from darkened windows. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone else's business. They knew she'd been Ashford's woman. They knew she worked at the Silver Dollar now, though she'd die before she'd do what some of the other girls did upstairs. She kept her head high, her stride purposeful. Let them look. Let them whisper. She'd survived this long. She'd survive tomorrow, too. But as she passed the church, something made her pause. A light flickered in one of the windows. The new preacher, perhaps, unable to sleep. She wondered what kind of man he was. Young or old, fire and brimstone or gentle mercy. Not that it mattered. She'd never darkened the door of his church. Some stains couldn't be washed clean, no matter how much holy water you used. Still, she found herself drawn closer, her feet moving of their own accord. The building was simple, honest in its plainness. No pretense, no false grandeur, just wood and nails and faith. She pressed her hand against the door, feeling the rough grain beneath her palm. Inside, someone was moving around. She could hear footsteps, the scrape of furniture. For a wild moment, she considered knocking, considered walking in and, confessing her sins, begging for absolution. The thought was so absurd she almost laughed. What would a preacher want with someone like her? She was beyond redemption, beyond saving. The good people of Cedar Ridge had made that abundantly clear. A coyote howled in the distance, breaking the spell. Maggie pulled her hand back as if the door had burned her. Foolish woman. Standing outside a church in the middle of the night like some lovesick girl. She turned to leave, but the wind caught her shawl, sending it flying. She chased after it, but it tangled in the church's fence posts. As she struggled to free it, she heard the church door open behind her. Her heart hammered in her chest. She couldn't face whoever it was, couldn't bear to see the disgust or pity in their eyes. But her shawl was caught fast, and running would mean leaving it behind, and she couldn't afford to lose even that small comfort. "Let me help you with that." The voice was younger than she'd expected, tinged with an accent she couldn't quite place. Not Eastern exactly, but not fully Western either. She kept her back turned as he approached, focusing on the stubborn knot of fabric. "It's caught on a nail," he said, reaching past her. His hands were steady as he worked the fabric free, careful not to tear it. "There you go." She mumbled her thanks, wrapping the shawl tight around her shoulders, still not meeting his eyes. She needed to leave, needed to get away before he realized who she was. But something in his manner, the lack of judgment in his voice, the simple kindness of the gesture, made her hesitate. "Cold night to be walking alone," he observed. Not quite a question. "I'm used to it." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "I suppose we all get used to things we shouldn't have to." There was something in his voice, a weight, an understanding that surprised her. "I'm Samuel Hawthorne, the new minister." She finally looked at him then, catching a glimpse of dark hair and tired eyes in the moonlight. Younger than she'd thought, maybe 30, with the kind of face that had seen trouble. She recognized it because she saw the same thing in her mirror every morning. "Maggie O'Brien," she said, then immediately wished she hadn't. Her name was poison in this town. If he recognized it, he gave no sign. "Pleased to meet you, Miss O'Brien. If you ever need anything, spiritual counsel, or just someone to talk to, my door is always open." The offer was so unexpected, so earnestly delivered, that for a moment she couldn't speak. When had anyone last made her such an offer without wanting something in return? "I don't belong in churches anymore, Reverend," she said quietly. "Churches are for sinners, Miss O'Brien. Saints have no need of them." She looked at him again, searching for mockery or condescension, but found neither. Just a young man standing in the cold, offering grace to someone who'd forgotten what it looked like. "Good night, Reverend," she managed, backing away. "Good night, Miss O'Brien. God be with you." She almost laughed at that. God be with you. As if God cared about what happened to Maggie O'Brien. But something in the way he said it, like he actually believed it, made the words stick in her mind as she hurried away. Back in her small room at the boarding house, Maggie sat on the edge of her narrow bed, still wrapped in her shawl. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Henderson snoring, could hear the settling of the old building. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same, the saloon, the whispers, the struggle to maintain some shred of dignity in a world that had already condemned her. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, a stranger had shown her kindness without condition, had spoken to her like she was still a person worthy of respect. It was such a small thing, yet it had cracked something open inside her, some door she'd thought rusted shut. She reached under her bed and pulled out a small wooden box, opening it to reveal her mother's rosary. The beads were worn smooth from years of use, though not by Maggie's hands. Not lately. She held them up to the lamplight, remembering her mother's voice. "God never abandons his children, most or even when we abandon him." Maggie wrapped the rosary around her hand but couldn't bring herself to pray. The words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat in the darkness, thinking about grace freely given, about doors that were always open, about a young minister with tired eyes who'd looked at her and seen something more than Cedar Ridge's fallen woman. It was foolish to hope. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But as she finally lay down to sleep, the rosary still wound around her fingers. She couldn't quite close that door that had cracked open. Couldn't quite forget the simple kindness in a stranger's voice. Tomorrow, she'd go back to the saloon. Tomorrow, she'd be practical, sensible, resigned to her fate. But tonight, in the darkness of her small room, Maggie O'Brien allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as beyond saving as she'd thought. 3 nights later, the winter storm that had been threatening finally arrived. Snow fell in thick sheets, transforming Cedar Ridge into a white wasteland. The Silver Dollar closed early. Even the most dedicated drinkers wouldn't venture out in such weather. Maggie counted it a mixed blessing. No wages meant stretching her meager savings even thinner, but at least she could rest her aching feet. She huddled in her room, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, listening to the wind howl outside. The boarding house was cold on the best of days, but tonight ice formed on the inside of the windows. She'd run out of coal for her small stove yesterday, and Mrs. Henderson wouldn't extend credit. By midnight, the cold had become unbearable. Her fingers were numb, her teeth chattering so hard she feared they might crack. She thought of the saloon. Jake sometimes let her sleep near the stove on nights like this. But the snow was too deep now, the wind too fierce. She'd freeze before she made it halfway there. Then she remembered the church. The new minister had said his door was always open. He'd probably meant for spiritual matters, not for freezing women seeking shelter. But desperation made her bold. Better to risk rejection than freeze to death in this miserable room. Maggie wrapped herself in every shawl and blanket she possessed and ventured into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her down the moment she stepped outside. Snow blinded her, filled her nose and mouth. She struggled forward, using the buildings as guides. Her hands so cold she couldn't feel them anymore. The church seemed miles away, though it was only 3 blocks. By the time she reached it, she was more ice than woman, her skirts frozen stiff, her hair white with snow. She pounded on the door with frozen fists, praying someone would hear over the wind's roar. The door opened so suddenly she nearly fell inside. Reverend Hawthorne caught her, his face etched with concern. "Miss O'Brien, good Lord, you're half frozen. Come in, come in." He guided her to a chair near the small stove in the corner of the church, then disappeared into the back room. She sat shivering, unable to speak through chattering teeth, watching snow melt and pool around her feet. He returned with blankets and a cup of something steaming. "Tea," he said, wrapping the blankets around her shoulders. "With a bit of honey. Sip it slowly." The cup burned her frozen fingers, but she didn't care. The warmth spreading down her throat was worth any pain. Gradually, feeling returned to her extremities, bringing with it 1,000 needle pricks of agony. "What were you doing out in this storm?" he asked, stoking the stove to burn hotter. I ran out of coal," she managed between sips. "The boarding house." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Mrs. Henderson. Yes, I've heard about her charitable nature." The dryness in his tone surprised her. "You should have come sooner. You could have died out there." "I didn't want to impose." The words sounded foolish even to her own ears. "Impose!" He sat in the chair across from her, and she noticed he was in his nightclothes, a worn nightshirt and trousers. Hastily donned, his feet were bare. "Miss O'Brien, sheltering those in need isn't an imposition. It's what this building is for." She looked around the simple church, at the rough pews and plain altar. It had been so long since she'd been inside a house of worship. "I told you, I don't belong in churches anymore. And I told you, churches are for sinners." He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Whatever you've done, whatever's been done to you, it doesn't change the fact that you're a child of God. You don't know what I've done." The words came out bitter, defensive. "No, I don't, and I don't need to. That's between you and the Lord." She stared at him, this strange young preacher who spoke of sin and redemption like he understood them personally. "You're not like other ministers I've known." A shadow crossed his face. "No, I suppose I'm not. I've walked some dark roads myself. Miss O'Brien, I know what it's like to feel beyond redemption." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the stove and the wind rattling the windows. Maggie found herself studying him in the lamplight. His face was younger than she'd first thought, but marked by experience. A thin scar ran along his jaw, a fighter's scar. His hands, wrapped around his own cup of tea, were calloused. Not the soft hands of someone raised to the ministry. "What brought you to Cedar Ridge?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Same thing that brings most people to the frontier. I suppose, a chance to start over, to leave the past behind." "Does it work, leaving the past behind?" "Sometimes, with God's grace." He paused. "And sometimes the past follows you anyway, but you learn to make peace with it." She thought of William, of the life she'd thought she'd have, of her mother's disappointed face if she could see her daughter now. "I don't know if I believe in God's grace anymore." That's all right. He believes in you. The simple statement, delivered without preaching or judgment, brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry. Not here, not in front of this man who was showing her more kindness than she'd known in months. "The storm's getting worse," Samuel said, rising to peer out the window. "You can't go back out in this. There's a small room in the back, my quarters. You can have the bed. I'll sleep out here by the stove." "I couldn't—" "Miss O'Brien." His voice was firm but kind. "Please, let me offer you this small shelter. No strings attached, no expectations. Just one soul helping another through a dark night." She wanted to refuse, to maintain what little pride she had left. But the thought of going back out into that storm, back to her freezing room, was unbearable. "Thank you," she whispered. He showed her to his quarters, a tiny room with barely space for a narrow bed and a desk. Everything was neat, almost austere, except for a well-worn Bible on the desk and what looked like a wrapped picture frame. "There are extra blankets in the chest," he said. "I'll be just outside if you need anything." "Reverend Hawthorne?" She stopped him as he turned to leave. "Why are you being so kind to me? You must know who I am, what people say about me." He paused in the doorway, his face half in shadow. "I know you're someone who needed help on a cold night. That's all I need to know." He started to leave, then turned back. "And, Miss O'Brien, what people say about us isn't always who we are. Sometimes it's just who we were, or who they think we were. God sees who we truly are, who we can become." After he left, Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the evening's events. The room was warm, the bed soft, luxuries she'd almost forgotten existed. She noticed the wrapped frame on the desk and, driven by curiosity, carefully unwrapped a corner. A woman's face looked back at her, beautiful, serene, with kind eyes. A wife, a lost love. She rewrapped it quickly, ashamed of her snooping. Through the thin door, she could hear Samuel moving around, settling himself by the stove. He began to hum softly, a hymn she remembered from childhood. The familiar melody, combined with the warmth and safety of the moment, broke something inside her. The tears came then, silent and unstoppable. Months of pain and shame and loneliness pouring out in the darkness. She muffled her sobs in the pillow, not wanting him to hear, not wanting to seem even more pathetic than she already did. But the tears wouldn't stop. She cried for the girl she'd been, full of hope and dreams. She cried for her mother, who'd died believing her daughter would make something of herself. She cried for the future she'd lost, for the respectability that would never be hers again. Eventually, exhaustion took over. As she drifted toward sleep, warm for the first time in days, she thought about Samuel Hawthorne's words. Who we can become. Was such a thing possible? Could she become someone other than Cedar Ridge's fallen woman? Through the door, she could hear him praying, his voice low and earnest. She couldn't make out the words, but the rhythm of it was soothing, like rain on a roof. For the first time in months, Maggie O'Brien fell asleep without fear, without cold, without the weight of tomorrow pressing down on her. The storm raged outside, but inside the small church, two wounded souls had found shelter, one offering sanctuary, the other accepting it, both understanding something fundamental about grace. Sometimes it comes when you least expect it, from the most unexpected sources, in the middle of the darkest storms. Neither of them knew that this night would change everything, that the simple act of offering and accepting help would be the first step on a journey neither had anticipated. But for now, it was enough that they were warm, safe, and not alone in the darkness. The candle on Samuel's desk flickered and went out, but the storm continued through the night, sealing them in their separate but connected solitudes, while something new and fragile began to take root in the space between them. Not quite hope, not quite love, but the possibility of both. Dawn came slowly, filtered through frost-covered windows. Maggie woke disoriented, the unfamiliar warmth and comfort confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then memory returned, the storm, the church, the kind minister who'd taken her in. She rose quietly, smoothing her wrinkled dress, trying to make herself presentable. She found Samuel already awake, tending the stove. He'd dressed properly now, black trousers, white shirt, ministerial collar, but his hair was still mussed from sleep, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "Good morning," he said, offering her a cup of coffee. "The storm's passed, but it's left quite a mess. Half the town's snowed in." She accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "I should go. You've been more than kind, but—" "Miss O'Brien," he interrupted her gently. "Before you go, I need to speak with you about something." Her heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. The sermon, the attempt to save her soul, the price of his kindness. But what he said next shocked her into silence. "I've been praying all night," he began, pacing before the stove. "About you, about me, about loneliness and purpose and God's plan." He stopped, facing her directly. "This may sound mad, but I believe God brought you here last night for a reason." "Reverend Hawthorne, please let me finish." His dark eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "I came to Cedar Ridge to start over, yes, but also because I felt called to serve. But the truth is, I'm failing. The congregation doesn't trust me yet. I'm young, unmarried, an outsider. They look at me and see someone who can't possibly understand their lives, their struggles." He moved closer, and she could see the desperation in his face. Carefully controlled, but present nonetheless. "A minister needs a wife," he continued, "not just for companionship, but to truly serve his community. The women won't confide in a bachelor. The families won't invite me to their homes. I'm half a minister without a helpmate." Maggie set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "What are you saying?" Samuel took a deep breath, then spoke the words that would change everything. "I need a wife tonight, and you need salvation, not from me. I can't save anyone, but from this town, from the life you're trapped in. We could help each other." The silence that followed was deafening. Maggie stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "You're asking me to marry you? Me?" "I know how it sounds." "Do you?" Her voice rose, sharp with disbelief and old pain. "Do you know what you're asking? I'm a fallen woman, reverend, a scarlet woman. The whole town knows what I was to William Ashford. Your congregation would run you out on a rail." "My congregation needs to learn about grace," he said firmly, "about redemption and second chances. What better way to teach them than by example?" She laughed, but it was a broken sound. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, who I've been." "I know you're someone who nearly froze to death rather than impose on anyone. I know you still carry your mother's rosary. I saw it fall from your pocket last night. I know you're fighting to maintain your dignity in impossible circumstances." His voice softened. "And I know you're someone who deserves better than what this town has given you." Maggie turned away, unable to bear the compassion in his eyes. Through the window, she could see the town beginning to stir, people digging out from the storm. Soon, someone would see her leaving the church, and the gossip would start, the minister and the saloon woman. It would destroy him before he'd even begun. "You'd be ruining yourself," she said quietly. "Your ministry, your reputation." "My reputation." He laughed, and she heard bitterness in it. "Miss O'Brien, Maggie, I spent 2 years in prison for nearly killing a man in a drunken brawl. My fiancé died while I was locked up, and I tried to drink myself to death when I got out. The only reason I'm standing here today is because a prison chaplain saw something in me worth saving." She turned back to him, seeing him clearly for the first time, not just a kind minister, but a man who'd walked through his own darkness. "I'm not some pure soul offering to lift you from the mire," he continued. "I'm a sinner saved by grace, offering partnership to another sinner. We're both broken, both trying to rebuild our lives. Maybe we could do it better together than alone. But the marriage," the word felt foreign on her tongue. "That's sacred. Permanent." "Yes, it is. And I wouldn't propose it lightly. But I've prayed on this all night, and I truly believe, This is God's answer. Not just to my prayers, but maybe to yours too. Maggie sank into a chair, overwhelmed. Marriage. To a minister. It was absurd, impossible. And yet, she thought of her freezing room, of endless nights at the Silver Dollar, of the way the good women of Cedar Ridge looked through her like she didn't exist. She thought of growing old in this town, alone and scorned, until she became one of those broken women who haunted the alleys behind the saloons. Then she looked at Samuel Hawthorne, this strange, earnest man who'd taken her in from the storm, who spoke to her like she was worth speaking to, who offered not charity but partnership. "What would you expect from me?" she asked carefully. "As your wife." He sat across from her, his expression serious. "Honesty, help with the ministry, visiting the sick, teaching Sunday school if you're willing. Companionship, a real marriage." "Maggie, not a business arrangement. I'd be a true husband to you, faithful and caring, and I'd expect you to be a true wife to me. The town will make your life miserable. They'll never accept me as a minister's wife. Then we'll change their minds. Together." He leaned forward. "Maggie, I'm not trying to save you. I'm asking you to save me. From loneliness. From failing in my calling. From becoming the kind of minister who preaches about love but doesn't know how to live it." She thought of her mother's rosary, hidden in her pocket, of prayers unanswered for so long she'd stopped praying. Was this God's idea of a joke? Or was it, as Samuel believed, grace in its strangest form? "When?" she heard herself ask. "Tonight? I can perform the ceremony myself. It's legal, though unusual. We'd need witnesses. Jake from the saloon," she said suddenly. "And Doc Morrison. They're the only ones in town who've shown me kindness. They might do it." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then you're saying yes?" Maggie stood, pacing to the window. Outside, Cedar Ridge looked clean and new under its blanket of snow, all its ugliness temporarily hidden. Maybe people could be like that too, covered in grace, made new. "I'm saying," she turned to face him, "I'm saying that if you're fool enough to take on the town pariah as your wife, then maybe I'm fool enough to accept. But Samuel," it was the first time she'd used his given name, "I need you to understand. I'm not pure. I'm not innocent. William Ashford and we lived as man and wife for months. In the eyes of the world, I'm ruined. In the eyes of the world, I'm a violent drunk," he replied steadily. "Good thing we're not living for the world's approval." They stood there, two damaged souls in a simple church, contemplating the madness of binding their lives together. Outside, church bells from the Catholic church across town began to ring, calling people to morning mass. "All right," Maggie said finally. "Yes, I'll marry you. Tonight. God help us both." Samuel crossed to her, taking her hands in his. His grip was warm, steady. "Sure. He will," he said simply. "He already has." They spent the morning planning, discussing the practical matters of combining two lives. Maggie would move her few possessions from the boarding house. They'd live in the small quarters behind the church until they could afford better. She'd leave the saloon immediately. He had some savings that would see them through until the congregation began tithing regularly. As they talked, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. This man, this virtual stranger, was offering her not just escape, but purpose. Not just shelter, but a home. "Maggie," Samuel said as she prepared to leave, to gather her things and speak to Jake, "I want you to know, I don't expect, that is, we can take time to truly know each other, to let affection grow naturally. I'm offering you my name and protection freely, without conditions." She looked at him, this man who was gambling his entire future on her, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for seeing me as more than what I've become." "We're all more than what we've become," he replied. "That's what redemption means." As she stepped out into the bright morning, Maggie O'Brien, soon to be Maggie Hawthorne, raised her face to the sun. Tonight, she'd stand before God and promise to honor and obey a man she barely knew. Tonight, she'd trade one kind of uncertainty for another. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than doom. And that, perhaps, was its own kind of miracle. The church looked different by lamplight. Shadows danced across the rough wooden walls, and the simple altar seemed to glow in the golden illumination. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and outside, fresh snow had begun to fall, muffling the sounds of the town. Maggie stood in the small room that would soon be hers, wearing her best dress, a dark green wool that had survived from better days. She'd washed her hair and pinned it up properly, trying to look like a respectable woman, a minister's wife. Her hands shook as she adjusted the collar. "You sure about this, girl?" Jake's gravelly voice came from the doorway. The bartender looked uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes, but he'd come when she'd asked. No questions beyond the initial shock. "No," she answered honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." Jake studied her with eyes that had seen too much. "That preacher, he seems decent enough, different from most. But Maggie, you don't have to do this. I told you, there's always work at the Silver Dollar. Serving drinks until I'm old and broken." She turned to face him. "Jake, he's offering me a chance at a real life. How can I not take it?" Before Jake could answer, Doc Morrison appeared, medical bag in hand. The elderly physician had delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge and buried the other half. He'd treated Maggie once, when she'd burned her hand at the saloon, and never charged her a penny. "Well, well," he said, his eyes twinkling behind wire spectacles. "When young Reverend Hawthorne said he needed witnesses for a wedding, I never imagined, but then, the Lord does work in mysterious ways. You don't have to stay if it offends you," Maggie said stiffly. "Offend me, child? I've seen enough of life to know that love, or whatever you want to call this, doesn't follow society's rules. If the Reverend wants to marry you, and you want to marry him, that's good enough for me." Samuel appeared then, dressed in his ministerial robes. He'd shaved and combed his hair, looking every inch the proper clergyman except for the nervousness in his eyes. "Are we ready?" They arranged themselves before the altar, Samuel facing Maggie, with Jake and Doc Morrison standing as witnesses. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, making the lamp flames flicker. "Dearly beloved," Samuel began, his voice steady despite everything, "we are gathered here tonight to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Maggie almost laughed at the strangeness of it. The groom performing his own ceremony, the saloon keeper and doctor as witnesses, the bride a woman no respectable person would acknowledge on the street. But Samuel's voice carried such conviction that the urge to laugh died away. Marriage is a sacred institution, ordained by God, a picture of Christ's love for his church. It is not to be entered into lightly or inadvisedly, but reverently and in the fear of God. He looked directly at her as he spoke, and she saw no doubt in his eyes, no second thoughts. Whatever madness had possessed him to propose this arrangement, he was committed to it now. "I, Samuel James Hawthorne, take you, Margaret Mary O'Brien, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." His hands were warm as they took hers, steady where hers trembled. She repeated the vows, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger. The ancient words felt both foreign and exactly right on her tongue. "Do you have a ring?" Doc Morrison prompted gently. Samuel produced a simple gold band, his mother's, he'd told her earlier. It was worn thin with age, but polished to a soft glow. He slipped it onto her finger, where it fit as if made for her. "By the power vested in me by God in the territory of Colorado, I pronounce us man and wife." He paused, color rising in his cheeks. "I suppose I may—" "That is, I may kiss the bride." It was a brief kiss, almost chaste, but Maggie felt it down to her toes. Not passion, not yet, but promise, a seal on this impossible bargain they'd made. "Well," Jake said, clearing his throat. That's that, then. Congratulations, Reverend Mrs. Hawthorne. Mrs. Hawthorne. The name felt like a costume she was trying on. Not quite fitting yet, but full of possibility. Doc Morrison shook Samuel's hand, then surprised Maggie by kissing her cheek. You've got courage, both of you. This town needs shaking up, and I have a feeling you're just the pair to do it. After the witnesses left, pressing through the falling snow to their homes, Samuel and Maggie stood alone in the church. The ceremony was over, but the marriage, the real work of it, was just beginning. Are you hungry? Samuel asked. I'm afraid I don't have much, but there's bread and soup. That sounds wonderful, she said, though food was the last thing on her mind. They ate in companionable silence in the small quarters that were now theirs. The soup was simple but hot, the bread a day old but filling. It was the first meal they shared as husband and wife, and Maggie found herself memorizing every detail, the way he broke his bread into the soup, the careful way he refilled her cup before his own. I should tell you about Martha, he said suddenly. The woman in the photograph. You don't have to. Yes, I do. We're married now. You should know. He stared into his soup as he spoke. We were engaged. She was everything I wasn't. Pure, devout, gentle. When I went to prison, she waited for me. Wrote me letters every week. Then the fever came through St. Louis. She was dead before I even got out. I'm sorry, Maggie said softly. I tried to drink myself to death after that. Nearly succeeded too. Then Father Francis, the prison chaplain, found me in an alley. More dead than alive. He dried me out. Helped me find my way to God. To redemption. He looked up at her. I'm telling you this so you understand. I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like God has abandoned you. I won't judge you for your past. Maggie, I can't. She reached across the small table, covering his hand with hers. We're a pair, aren't we? The drunk and the fallen woman, playing at being respectable. Not playing, he corrected gently. Becoming. With God's grace, we're becoming who he meant us to be. Later, as they prepared for bed, the awkwardness returned. They stood on opposite sides of the small room, unsure how to navigate this new intimacy. I can sleep in the church, Samuel offered. By the stove, like last night, until you're comfortable. No, Maggie's voice was firm. We're married. We'll act like it. The bed's narrow, but we'll manage. They lay side by side in the darkness, careful not to touch, listening to each other breathe. The storm had picked up again, sealing them in their small world. Maggie? Samuel's voice was quiet in the darkness. Thank you for saying yes, for taking this chance with me. She turned toward him, though she couldn't see his face in the dark. Thank you for asking, for seeing something in me worth saving. Not saving, he corrected. Partnering with. There's a difference. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence now. Outside their window, Cedar Ridge slept under its blanket of snow, unaware that everything had changed. Come morning, the news would spread like wildfire. The new minister had married the saloon woman. There would be shock, outrage, probably calls for his removal. But that was tomorrow's battle. Tonight, they were simply Samuel and Maggie Hawthorne, two broken people who'd found each other in a storm and decided to face the world together. As sleep finally took her, Maggie felt the bed shift as Samuel relaxed beside her. Not touching, not yet, but present, solid, real. For the first time in months, she didn't fall asleep afraid of what morning would bring. She'd taken the most enormous gamble of her life, betting everything on a man she barely knew and a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. But lying there in the darkness, wearing an old wedding ring and a new name, Maggie allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally bet on the right thing. The lamp burned out, leaving them in complete darkness, but neither moved to relight it. They simply lay there, two people learning to be married, learning to trust, learning that sometimes salvation comes not as a bolt from heaven, but as a quiet presence in the darkness, promising that whatever comes, You won't face it alone. The news broke with Sunday's dawn. By the time the church bells rang for morning service, all of Cedar Ridge knew that Reverend Hawthorne had married Maggie O'Brien. The scandal rippled through the town like wildfire, growing more outrageous with each telling. Maggie stood beside Samuel at the church door, wearing her green dress and a simple bonnet, trying to look like she belonged there. Her hands trembled as the first congregants arrived, their face masks of shock and disapproval. Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, no relation to the doctor, was the first to speak her mind. The banker's wife had ruled Cedar Ridge society for 20 years, and her word carried weight. "Reverend," she said, her voice dripping ice, "surely there's been some misunderstanding. This woman cannot possibly be your wife." "Good morning, Mrs. Morrison." Samuel replied calmly, "May I present Mrs. Margaret Hawthorne, my wife. We were married last evening." The older woman's face went from pale to red. "This is an outrage. A man of God consorting with such a creature. The church board will hear of this immediately." "I'm sure they will," Samuel said. "Please, take your usual seat. The service will begin shortly." More people arrived, each reaction a variation on the theme of horror and indignation. Some refused to enter at all, turning on their heels when they saw Maggie. Others came in but sat as far from the front as possible, whispering behind gloved hands. Thomas Garrett, owner of the largest ranch in the area and head of the church board, pulled Samuel aside. "Reverend, I respect a man's right to make his own choices. But this, have you lost your mind? That woman has been living in sin with William Ashford. She works at the Silver Dollar, for God's sake." "She worked there," Samuel corrected. "Past tense, and as for her past sins, I seem to recall something about casting the first stone." "Don't quote scripture at me, boy," Garrett snapped. "You've been here less than a week. You don't understand how things work in Cedar Ridge. Then perhaps it's time things changed." By the time the service began, the church was only half full. Those who remained sat in judgment, their eyes boring into Maggie's back as she took her place in the front pew, the minister's wife's traditional seat. Samuel climbed to the pulpit, and Maggie could see the tension in his shoulders. But when he spoke, his voice was strong and clear. "My text this morning comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 8. He opened his Bible. "And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou?" A murmur ran through the congregation. "Mrs. Morrison actually gasped. Samuel continued, undeterred. "And Jesus said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." The silence was deafening. Maggie kept her eyes fixed on the cross behind the pulpit, feeling the weight of every stare. "I stand before you today not just as your minister, but as a sinner saved by grace." Samuel continued, "Some of you may have heard rumors about my past. Let me confirm them. I spent 2 years in Missouri State Penitentiary for assault. I was a drunk, a brawler, a man lost to rage and despair. By all rights, I should be dead in an alley somewhere, not standing in this pulpit." Several people shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they'd expected. "But God had other plans. He sent a man to pull me from that alley, to show me that redemption was possible even for someone like me. And now, He's called me here, to Cedar Ridge, to minister to all souls, not just the righteous, but the lost, the broken, the cast aside." His eyes swept the congregation. "Yes, I married Margaret O'Brien. Yes, she has a past. So do I. So do all of you, if we're being honest. The difference is that she's had the courage to leave hers behind, to reach for something better. How many of us can say the same?" "This is blasphemy! Mrs. Morrison stood, her face purple with rage. "Comparing that trollop to whom, Mrs. Morrison?" Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. "To the woman at the well, to Mary Magdalene, to any of the broken people Jesus chose to heal and love? Tell me, which sinners deserve grace and which don't? Where exactly do we draw that line?" The banker's wife gathered her skirts and marched out, followed by several others. But some remained, including Doc Morrison, who looked distinctly amused by the whole affair. Samuel continued his sermon, speaking of redemption and new beginnings, of churches that should be hospitals for sinners rather than museums for saints. His words were passionate, almost desperate, and Maggie realized he was fighting for more than just their marriage. He was fighting for his vision of what the church could be. When the service ended, those who remained filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact. Only a few stopped to shake Samuel's hand. Old Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry, surprised Maggie by patting her arm. "You good woman now," she said in broken English. "Past is past." Doc Morrison was more direct. "That was quite a sermon. Reverend, you've certainly given them something to think about, though I suspect your collection plate will be rather light for a while." "The Lord will provide," Samuel said, though Maggie caught the worry in his eyes. As they walked back to their quarters, Maggie could feel the weight of the morning crushing down on her. "I've ruined you," she said quietly. "They'll run you out of town because of me." Samuel stopped, turning to face her. "No, they'll try to run us out because we're showing them truths they don't want to see. There's a difference." That afternoon, Thomas Garrett returned with 2 other board members. Maggie made herself scarce, but she could hear every word through the thin walls. "It's simple, Reverend," Garrett said. "Annul this marriage. Send the woman away. We'll forget this ever happened. And if I refuse, then you'll find yourself without a church. We didn't hire you to harbor fallen women and preach radical notions. I thought you hired me to preach the gospel. Don't be smart with us, boy. You have until next Sunday to come to your senses. Choose wisely." After they left, Maggie found Samuel sitting at his desk, head in his hands. "You should do it," she said. "Annul the marriage. Save your ministry." He looked up at her, and she was surprised to see not defeat, but determination in his eyes. "Do you want out, Maggie? Say the word, and I'll release you from your vows. But don't ask me to abandon you for their approval. I won't do it." "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this for me?" He stood, crossing to her. "Because I believe this is right. Because I believe God brought us together. And because—" He hesitated, then continued. "Because in just 2 days, you've become important to me. Is that so hard to believe?" Maggie felt tears threaten. No one had ever fought for her before. No one had ever thought she was worth losing something for. "They'll destroy you. Then we'll build something new from the ruins." He took her hands. "But we'll build it together, if you're willing." That evening, as they prepared a simple supper, a knock came at the door. Maggie tensed, expecting more angry board members, but it was Jake, carrying a basket. "Figured you might be running low on supplies," he said gruffly, what with the collection plate being light and all. Inside the basket were bread, cheese, dried beef, and even a small cake. "Jake, we can't—" Maggie began. "Sure you can. Call it a wedding present." He looked at Samuel. "That was some sermon this morning. Reverend, got a few people thinking. Not everyone agrees with Adelaide Morrison and her crowd." After Jake left, they found similar gifts on their doorstep. Vegetables from the widow Patterson's garden. Eggs from someone who didn't leave a name. A warm quilt with a note that simply said, "God bless your union." "See?" Samuel said, holding up the quilt. "We're not as alone as we thought." That night, as they lay in their narrow bed, Maggie found herself moving closer to her husband. The day had been brutal, but they'd survived it together. When Samuel's arm came around her, tentative and questioning, she didn't pull away. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, "for standing up for me, for us, always," he whispered back. "That's what marriage means. Whatever storms come, we weather them together." Outside, Cedar Ridge slept fitfully, a town divided. Come morning, the battle lines would be drawn more clearly. There would be those who stood with the Morrisons and Garretts, demanding respectability and tradition. And there would be those who'd heard something in Samuel's sermon that resonated, who wondered if maybe grace could be bigger than they'd thought. But for now, in their small room behind the church, Samuel and Maggie Hawthorne held each other and prepared for whatever came next. They'd thrown down a gauntlet that morning, challenged the very foundations of what Cedar Ridge thought it knew about sin and redemption. The real fight was just beginning. The sickness came with the spring thaw. What started as a few cases of fever in the mining camp spread quickly through Cedar Ridge, carried on the muddy boots of men seeking medicine and comfort. By the third week of March, Doc Morrison was overwhelmed, working day and night until he himself collapsed from exhaustion. Typhoid, he managed to tell Samuel before the fever took him. It's bad. We'll lose people before this is over. The town that had been so divided over Samuel and Maggie's marriage suddenly faced a common enemy. Adelaide Morrison, despite her previous hostility, appeared at the church door, her usual imperious manner replaced by fear. "My grandson," she said, her voice breaking. "Little James. He's burning up with fever. The doctor's too ill to come. Please, Reverend—" Samuel didn't hesitate. "I'll come immediately. Maggie, gather the medical supplies." Over the past months, Maggie had quietly proven herself. While many still shunned her socially, they'd grudgingly acknowledged her skills. She could read and write better than most, kept meticulous records, and had a gentle way with the sick that reminded older residents of the nursing sisters who'd passed through years ago. "I'm coming with you," she said, already packing clean linens and what medicines they had. Adelaide Morrison looked like she wanted to object, but desperation won. "Please, just help my grandson." The Morrison house, usually a showcase of prosperity, had become a house of fear. James Morrison, age 7, lay delirious in his bed, his mother weeping beside him. Samuel knelt by the bed to pray while Maggie went to work, her movements efficient and calm. "We need to break the fever," she said. "Cool water, constantly applied. The bedding changed every few hours. And someone needs to make sure he drinks, even if it's just drops at a time." "How do you know these things?" Adelaide asked, watching Maggie work. "My mother was a midwife," Maggie replied, wringing out a cool cloth. "She taught me about fevers, about nursing, before." She trailed off, focusing on the child. They stayed through the night, Samuel praying, Maggie nursing, the boy's family hovering anxiously. By dawn, the fever had broken. James opened his eyes, asked for water, and his grandmother wept with relief. "Thank you," Adelaide said, grasping Maggie's hands. "Thank you both." Word spread quickly. The minister and his wife had saved the Morrison boy. Soon, other families were calling for help. The prejudice that had seemed so insurmountable began to crack under the pressure of necessity. Maggie organized the church into a makeshift hospital. The pews were pushed back, cots brought in. Women who'd crossed the street to avoid her now worked beside her, following her instructions. She taught them how to recognize the stages of fever, how to prepare broths for the weak, how to keep the sickness from spreading. Samuel moved between houses, praying with the sick, comforting the dying, burying those they couldn't save. But it was Maggie who emerged as the true hero of the epidemic. She worked tirelessly, moving from patient to patient with a calm competence that inspired confidence. "Where did you find such a woman?" Thomas Garrett asked Samuel one evening. His own wife was among the sick, and Maggie had spent hours nursing her. "I didn't find her," Samuel replied. "God brought us together." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology. Reverend, both of you, I judged hastily." The epidemic reached its peak in the third week. They lost 12 souls, including a young mother and 2 children from the mining camps. Samuel performed the funerals, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and grief. Maggie stood beside him, her presence a comfort to the mourners. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sickness began to retreat. The new cases dwindled. The sick began to recover. Doc Morrison, weak but alive, resumed his duties, praising Maggie's efforts. "You've got a natural gift for healing," he told her. "Have you ever considered formal training?" Maggie laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. "A woman like me, who'd take me?" A woman like you saved half this town. The doctor replied firmly. Don't sell yourself short. On the first Sunday after the epidemic ended, the church was packed. Every pew was full, with people standing in the back. Samuel looked out at the congregation. Faces that had shown him contempt now showed respect, even affection. We've been through the valley of the shadow of death, he began. We've lost friends, family. We've faced our mortality and our helplessness. But we've also seen something beautiful. A community coming together, putting aside differences to care for one another. His eyes found Maggie in her usual pew. We've seen that heroism doesn't always come from expected places, that God often uses the people we overlook, the ones we judge, to show us His grace. After the service, there was a different quality to the handshakes and greetings. Women who'd snubbed Maggie now pressed her hand, thanking her for her care. Men nodded respectfully. The children, less bound by adult prejudices, flocked to her, having learned during the epidemic that the minister's wife always had a kind word and sometimes a piece of penny candy. Adelaide Morrison approached last, her grandson's hand in hers. Mrs. Hawthorne, she said formally. Then, more softly, Maggie, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my grandson's life. I've been a foolish, prideful woman. Can you forgive me? Maggie's eyes filled with tears. There's nothing to forgive. We all do what we think is right at the time. No, Adelaide said firmly. I did what I thought would preserve my standing, my reputation. You did what was right. There's a difference. She paused. I'm organizing a ladies' aid society to help families affected by the epidemic. I'd be honored if you'd help lead it. The transformation wasn't complete. Some still whispered, still judged, but the tide had turned. In facing death together, Cedar Ridge had learned something about life, about grace, about the danger of quick judgments. That evening, Samuel and Maggie sat outside their small quarters, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. They were exhausted, worn thin by weeks of crisis. But there was peace between them now, a deep understanding forged in shared trial. You were magnificent, Samuel said. The way you cared for people, led them. I've never been prouder to call someone my wife. Maggie leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Over the months of their marriage, affection had grown into something deeper. She loved this man who'd risked everything for her, who'd stood by her when the world tried to tear them apart. We make a good team, she said. Yes, we do. He kissed her forehead. Garrett actually suggested increasing my salary. Said a minister with such a capable wife deserved better than one room behind the church. A real house. The thought was almost too wonderful to believe. A small one, but yes, with a garden, if you'd like. Maggie thought of planting vegetables, flowers, putting down roots in soil that had once seemed so hostile. I'd like that very much. As darkness fell, they could hear the sounds of town life returning to normal. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant sound of the saloon piano. But it was a different normal now. The epidemic had changed Cedar Ridge, broken down some walls, built new connections. Do you ever regret it? Maggie asked suddenly. That night you asked me to marry you. Samuel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, that night, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me. You saved this whole town. How could I regret that? They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found each other in the midst of judgment and isolation, who'd built something beautiful from broken pieces. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did. But tonight, they were simply Samuel and Maggie Hawthorne, minister and healer, husband and wife. The stars came out one by one, and Maggie found herself thinking of her mother's words, God never abandons his children. Looking at her husband, at the town that had finally begun to accept her, at the life they'd built together, she finally believed it might be true. The epidemic had tested them all, revealed both the worst and best of human nature. But in the end, love had proven stronger than fear. grace more powerful than judgment. And in a small church on the frontier, two wounded souls had found not just each other, but their purpose. It was, Maggie thought, something very like redemption. 5 years had passed since that snowy night when Samuel Hawthorne had opened his door to a freezing woman and changed both their lives forever. The small house on Elm Street, with its white picket fence and flourishing garden, stood as testament to how far they'd come. Maggie sat at her kitchen table, morning sun streaming through gingham curtains, writing careful notes in her medical journal. Doc Morrison had been true to his word, arranging for her to study with a visiting physician from Denver. She wasn't a doctor, that was still impossible for a woman, but she'd become Cedar Ridge's unofficial nurse and midwife, respected and sought after. "Mama, look!" 3-year-old Grace burst through the door, her dark curls bouncing, clutching a handful of wildflowers. Behind her, 18-month-old Samuel Jr. toddled determinedly, trying to keep up with his sister. "Beautiful, sweetheart," Maggie said, accepting the slightly crushed bouquet. "Shall we put them in water?" She heard Samuel's footsteps on the porch before he appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up at the domestic scene. 5 years had added a few lines around his eyes and threads of silver to his dark hair, but he was still the man who'd offered her salvation on a desperate night. "Good morning, family," he said, scooping up both children to delighted squeals. "Papa, we picked flowers," Grace announced. "I see that. Did you leave any for the bees?" As the children chattered about their morning adventures, Maggie marveled at the ordinariness of it all. This life, husband, children, home, purpose, had once seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. Now it was simply Tuesday morning in the Hawthorne household. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been those who never accepted her, who moved to other churches or towns rather than worship alongside Cedar Ridge's former fallen woman. But many more had stayed, had watched as Maggie proved herself again and again, through the epidemic, through countless acts of quiet service, through the simple reality of a marriage that grew stronger each year. "Don't forget, the church board meets tonight," Samuel reminded her, pouring coffee. "They want to discuss the new school building." Maggie nodded. She served on the board now, another impossibility made real. Adelaide Morrison had nominated her herself, declaring that anyone who could organize relief efforts during an epidemic could certainly help plan a school. "And I have 3 births to attend this month," Maggie added. "The Wagner twins and John Chen's wife. Busy times." Samuel agreed. Good times. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Samuel opened it to find a young woman, travel-worn and obviously distressed. Her dress was too fine for Cedar Ridge, but wrinkled and mud-stained from the road. "Reverend Hawthorne?" she asked tentatively. I was told you might help me. I have nowhere else to go." Maggie saw the signs immediately. The careful way the woman held herself, the desperation barely masked by pride, the way her hand moved unconsciously to her middle. Another woman in trouble, another soul seeking refuge. "Come in," Samuel said immediately. "You're welcome here." The woman's story tumbled out over tea and biscuits. Julia Stratton, from Colorado Springs. Engaged to a prominent businessman who disappeared when she told him about the baby. Cast out by her family, her money nearly gone. She'd heard about the minister in Cedar Ridge who didn't turn anyone away. "I know what people will think," Julia said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I've sinned, but I don't know what else to do." Maggie reached across the table, taking the girl's hands in hers. "I know exactly what people will think," she said gently. "I've been where you are, but you've come to the right place." They settled Julia in the small room addition they'd built for just such situations. Over the years, it had sheltered runaway wives, orphaned children, lost souls of every variety. The people of Cedar Ridge had come to expect it. The minister and his wife took in strays. Some grumbled, but most had learned to trust Samuel and Maggie's judgment. That Sunday, Samuel introduced Julia to the congregation simply as a new member of our community who needs our Christian love and support. There were whispers, of course. There always were. But there were also women who remembered Maggie's care during the epidemic, who approached Julia after service with offers of work, friendship, understanding. "It's not as hard as it was for me," Maggie told Samuel that evening as they watched their children play in the garden. "The town's changed." "You changed it," he replied. "You and Grace." She smiled at the memory. Her pregnancy with Grace had been the final seal on her acceptance. A baby made the reformed fallen woman into a mother, something the good wives of Cedar Ridge could understand and embrace. When she'd nearly died in childbirth, the entire town had prayed. When she'd survived, they'd celebrated as one. As weeks passed, Julia integrated into the community much as Maggie had, though more easily. She had Maggie to guide her, to deflect the worst of the judgment, to show her that redemption was possible. She worked at the new school, teaching the younger children, her gentle manner winning over even skeptics. One evening, as Maggie was closing up the small clinic she now ran beside the church, she found a familiar figure waiting in the shadows. William Ashford looked older, his once fine clothes showing wear, his confident manner replaced by something almost humble. "Hello, Maggie," he said quietly. She stiffened, the old pain flaring briefly before settling into mere memory. "Mr. Ashford, I'd heard you were back in town." "My wife died," he said bluntly. "Consumption. I've come back to start over, I suppose." He paused, studying her. "You look well. Happy." "I am happy," she said simply. "I heard you married the minister, have children now, become quite the pillar of the community." There was no mockery in his tone, only a kind of wondering regret. "I'm glad. What I did to you, it was unforgivable." "But not unredeemable," Maggie said, surprising herself. "We all make choices. William, some lead to darkness, some to light. The grace is that we get to keep choosing, every day." He looked at her for a long moment. "The minister's a lucky man," he said finally. "I hope he knows it." "He does," she said. "We both do." After he left, Maggie stood in the gathering dusk, thinking about the strange turns life could take. The man who'd ruined her had become the instrument of her salvation, in a way. Without that fall, she'd never have risen to this height. She walked home through streets she knew by heart, greeting neighbors who waved from porches, stopping to check on old Mrs. Patterson's arthritis. The silver dollar still stood at the end of Main Street, but Jake had made it more respectable over the years. He still served drinks, but he also served meals now, and the upstairs rooms were for travelers, not working girls. As she approached her house, she saw Samuel through the window, reading to the children by lamplight. Grace was curled against his side, Samuel Jr. on his lap, both rapt with attention. The sight made her heart swell with a gratitude so fierce it almost hurt. She'd been Maggie O'Brien once, a woman scorned and cast aside, surviving on pride and desperation. Now she was Maggie Hawthorne, wife, mother, healer, respected member of the community. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been real, inside. Samuel looked up from the book, his face lighting up as it always did when he saw her. "You're just in time for the best part," he said. She settled beside them, Samuel Jr., immediately climbing into her lap. As Samuel continued the story, his voice weaving magic in the lamplight, Maggie thought about Julia Stratton, about all the lost souls who would find their way to this door in years to come. They would find what she had found, not just shelter, but hope. Not just acceptance, but family. The story ended with the princess finding her prince, living happily ever after. Grace sighed contentedly. "Just like you and Papa," she said sleepily. "Yes," Maggie agreed, kissing her daughter's head. "Just like me and Papa." Later, after the children were asleep, she and Samuel sat on their porch, watching stars appear in the vast Colorado sky. The night was warm, full of the sounds of summer, crickets, distant laughter, life going on as it always did. "No regrets?" Samuel asked, as he did sometimes. though less often now. "Not one," she answered, as she always did, meaning it more each time. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found each other in the depths of winter and built a life worthy of any spring. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. It always did. There would be births to attend, souls to counsel, children to raise, a community to serve. But tonight, they were simply Samuel and Maggie Hawthorne, sitting on the porch of the house they'd built together, living proof that redemption wasn't just a word in a sermon, but a reality that could be lived, day by day, choice by choice, grace by grace. The lamp in the window burned steady and bright, a beacon for other lost souls who might need to find their way home. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, another desperate woman was gathering courage to knock on a door, to take a chance on grace, to discover that salvation sometimes comes in the most unexpected forms. The frontier had taught them all hard lessons about survival. But here, in this small house on Elm Street, they'd learned something even more valuable. That love could redeem the past, that grace could transform the present, and that hope, real, lasting hope, was always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. Thank you for listening to this story of love and redemption from the Wild West. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps somewhere unexpected? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reactions make this journey through the American frontier even more special. Until next time, partners.